Hello, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Hopefully you can hear me right now. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Southern Fire Exchange. I'd like to first thank everyone for joining us today as we feature our first webinar tied to our new Spotlight series. If anyone right now is having difficulty hearing me or having problems with the audio, please let us know in the chat box on the right side of the screen. As part of the Spotlight series with the Southern Fire Exchange, every 2 months we will be focusing on a specific fire science topic. Relevant to Southeastern practitioners and researchers. Each bi-monthly Spotlight will include research summaries, field tours, workshops, fact sheets, expert 10-minute interviews, and webinars that are all tied to that specific fire science theme. So during the months of May and June, we're focusing on fire and wetlands and featuring many products that are tied to the recent special issue of the open access journal Fire Ecology. Today, we're very excited to have our guest speaker, Dr. Patrick Inglett, Assistant Professor of Biochemistry, Wetlands, and Aquatic Systems at the University of Florida, Gainesville, presenting our webinar entitled Setting Back the Clock, Fire Biogeochemistry and its Importance in the Restoration of Low-Nutrient Wetland Ecosystems. Before we start, if you haven't yet, as we mentioned earlier, please see the chat pod on the right side of your screen. In that pod, you can submit questions for the speaker, questions for me, or questions for the general audience. While we wait a few minutes for everyone to assemble for the webinar today, please take a moment, if you haven't already, and introduce yourself to the group, and let us know where you're located today and what organization you're affiliated with. I'd also like to take this opportunity to share a little bit of information about the Southern Fire Exchange if you guys are not familiar with it. SFE is a regional program for fire science delivery in the Southeast, funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. Our mission is to increase the availability and application of fire science information for natural resource management, and to serve as a conduit for fire managers to share new research needs with the research community. The best way to stay connected with us at SFE is by joining our email list or by following one of our social media channels. For more information, to connect with us on either of those areas, visit our website at www.southernfireexchange.org. And now on to our presentation. Dr. Inglett has a PhD and an MS from the University of Florida in Soil and Water Science and a BS in Applied Biology from Georgia Tech. Much of his current and past research has focused on measuring and understanding carbon and nutrient cycling in Florida wetland environments. He has numerous publications related to these topics, and today he'll be talking about some of his recent research that he and his colleagues have published in the Fire Ecology Special Wetlands issue. As a reminder, for everyone participating today, we ask that you please enter your questions in the chat pod at the end of the presentation. We'll have a Q&A period, and we will field and have Dr. Inglett try and address those questions. And finally, if you need to leave our webinar early today or would like to go back and see it at a later date, we are recording the webinar and it will be archived on our YouTube page within about a week. So be sure to check back at southernfireexchange.org or check our YouTube page, which we will have a link to find that webinar archive. So let's welcome Dr. Inglett, and thank you for joining us today.
Okay, can everybody hear me? All right, very good. I would like to say that thank you, David, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak today on the research that we have been conducting over the past several years. As David said, this is going to address several of the papers in that recent issue of Fire Ecology, specifically those dealing with wetland fire biogeochemistry. And hope for those of you attending today, thank you for attending, and I hope that it is out of interest in the subject that you are attending with us and not being forced to. But for those of you who are being forced to attend this, I hope it's an enjoyable discussion or an enjoyable topic for you. And just a few, I did this kind of in reverse order, but this is not just my work, as you can see from the publications, but also a number of other people are involved in this, and you will see their names scattered throughout. But just to give credit to a few of my students, Cassandra Medvedelf, Shaolin Liao, and Benjamin Hogue, this is part of their dissertations and theses. And Dr. Todd Osborne and Dr. Willie Harris and Dr. Kanika Inglett in our department also had a very integral role in this research. And none of this could be accomplished without a huge team of people conducting a lot of the fire aspects of it, and the sampling, etc. And so we had a large group of folks from the national park, as well as the Hole in the Donut Restoration Project, Lauren, Sarah, and Jonathan Taylor down there, and a lot of people involved in field assistance and laboratory analyses. So got to give credit for those folks. Getting into the topic, though, of fire biogeochemistry and why, I guess, why we got into it. We were first involved in the site that we're going to discuss today, but it quickly became evident that fire was a very important aspect of that ecosystem, being in South Florida, being in the Everglades, and we have all known these kind of importance of fire as a ecosystem driver, directly relating to vegetation composition, as well as nutrient cycling. But the nutrient cycling aspects of it have largely been unexplored, particularly in wetland systems, but even in a variety of other ecosystems. We know very well what the act of combustion does. We know that this is a primary driver on carbon cycling in particular, but organic matter and organic residues, in addition to influencing structure of the vegetation community. So we know that there's a lot of this involved in the total ecosystem as a whole. But what it does, maybe more on a fine scale approach in altering nutrient cycles, or how it deals with the underlying components of an ecosystem, namely the microbes and those microbial communities. That's a lot of what we study in biogeochemistry. And so I got interested in this because those microbial communities are integral to our ecosystems. I wanted to understand just what it was that a managed fire in our system does. And so we had fire is used in other ecosystems, and certainly other wetland ecosystems also. Throughout the Everglades, there are management plans throughout South Florida and the Southeast. There are definitely management plans that involve fire and its use in ecosystem manipulation and just management in general. We were asking the question in our particular system, which is not what you would think. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it is a seasonally flooded wetland system. So there are periods when definitely in fire season it's drawn down and it can burn all the way to the ground. So we had to ask the question as to what fire would do in this system, both from a physical standpoint, just heating of the system and soil temperature, etc., during the actual burn, and how then does it alter all of our nutrient cycles related to species composition, long-term productivity, etc. And the importance of fire, people have known that it involves the loss of carbon and nitrogen from systems, as well as the conversion and deposition of phosphorus in the form of ash and char residues. So we were also interested in this case, a phosphorus limited system, A lot of the work on fire has been done in nitrogen-limited upland and terrestrial kinds of systems. We were asking the question is, what does that do? We had some preconceived notions as to what it would do in this phosphorus-limited system, and I think the results are a little bit surprising and a little bit agreeing with what we suspected, but the kind of just a different take on nitrogen versus phosphorus limitation in systems and the role that fire would play in that for a driver of nutrients. The study site that we were focusing on, for those of you not familiar with South Florida, is located in Everglades National Park, and it is a combination of two kinds of ecosystems. One is that there is a native natural wet prairie, which would be considered a marl prairie. It's calcareous soil, marl, a significant component of algae growing on the surface, in conjunction with some native species like Muhlenbergia and Cladium, sawgrass species. It is definitely a phosphorus limited in its natural state system, seasonal short hydro period, meaning that for only the months of July, August, September, maybe through October, it is saturated and flooded. The rest of the time it's in a sort of flooded or just at least a moist and wet, but then at certain periods of time, such as April, May, early June, it is bone dry, and so gives us a good difference or contrast between fire being used in the other systems, where maybe you're just trying to burn off the vegetation in a completely flooded ecosystem, as fire is used in some of the northern Everglades systems. It also, the hole in the donut is also the site of a massive restoration project. Certain parts of this marl prairie were converted into agriculture back in the early 1900s. And in the process of that, the soils were disturbed, nutrients were added, and after the national park was established and the farming ceased, the system quickly became taken over by an exotic and invasive Chinus terebinthifolius, which is Brazilian pepper, and that would be shown here in this lower inset picture, this dark green area. Very thick monocultures, tops out, totally obliterates, I wouldn't even say it impacts, it totally obliterates this South Florida ecosystem. And the restoration of this obviously was, needed and undertaken, and several different approaches were tried, including vegetation removal, burning, spraying with chemical, all kinds of herbicides, etc., just to try to inhibit it. None of that seemed to work, and what was the source of the problem was a combination of seed bank and also the residual nutrients stored in the soil. So the most successful, and I would consider it successful, strategy to restore the site was to completely scrape these shallow soils down to the limestone bedrock, and then allow the system to revegetate and success from almost ground zero. And that has been very successful. This shot that you're seeing here is one of those sites. So while it's not perfect, it differs a little bit compositionally from the previous picture of a marl prairie, but a lot of the same species are there, and we have documented in some other research the similarities and the beneficial characteristics that this approach, it does restore wetland functions. And even that, very useful wetland functions, not degraded wetland functions, but it is functioning as a wetland. There are some vegetation issues, in particular with shrubs and woody vegetation, which are still in these systems because there's residual phosphorus left over. They can't scrape 100% of that phosphorus-rich soil out. And so the system is progressing from this high state of phosphorus availability, and it is, as it progresses, years and years of vegetation as well as fire management, it is successing toward phosphorus limitation. And that is the quote, my version of restoration. Some people call the scraping restoration. I call the ultimate endpoint of achieving phosphorus limitation where we will get the phosphorus limited community typical of this type of system. So from a nutrient standpoint, that's my aspect of it. Phosphorus is the key, or one of the critical things, combining with hydrology to affect species composition as well as nutrient cycling in the system, but also fire being the other management tool which to come through periodically and help remove or at least lessen the dominance of some of this woody vegetation. So fire is used as a vegetation manipulation in this case. We were investigating what it had to do with our existing study in terms of the nutrient dynamics, which we know are also key to the restoration and health of this ecosystem. So the need to achieve phosphorus limitation in this system, key. Our study site is laid out kind of like this, this little Google Earth image, and you can see the National Park Research Centers, the former Nike missile base from back in the 60s. A lot of interesting history in this site. For those of you who are interested, if you ever visit the national park, you can now go to the Nike missile base, but it's also a good idea to see this. This is also an overview, kind of a part of the restoration project that's going on, and what they've been doing is periodically over the past about 20 years scraping. You can see some of the early scrapes in these areas, and they take the spoil and they pile it up in these large spoil mounds, which they are still deciding what to do. But you can see the improvement, dramatic improvement over what it was in the shyness, these dark green patches. And those are yet to be cleared. Some of this, I believe, is maybe even in this area to the north of the research centers is being, I think, currently cleared. But some of this is in its pristine state. This is what we would call as a pristine marl prairie. Incidentally, this Google Earth image was taken after our fire, so you can see the difference. I'll show you what we have as a native marl prairie system that was in this pattern right here, and the fire actually came through this part right here, so you can see the fire scar, if you will, on our landscape. But these areas have been cleared in different stages, and so different years, and so a gradient or a time sequence, if you will, of succession following the clearing or following the removal of the soil. And so we have the native marl prairie system, and we had another site that was restored in the year 2000. So it was scraped in the year 2000. When we conducted this research, then it was approximately 12 years old or 11 years old. And so we chose, or the location of our burn encompassed these two areas, and we chose sites that corresponded to higher elevation and lower elevation, and some of that today you might see the difference between high and low elevation, but in some of those cases they were just lumped together, viewed as more or less replicates. But we had two locations that we chose in the native area and in the restored area. The restored area, of course, is still considered, compared to the reference, it is higher in phosphorus and slightly different elevation, so it's a little bit different hydrology. But that's the point of our study, was to see that. At each of those locations, then, we selected or identified, isolated, some control plots and then some adjacent plots that were going to be included in the burn. And then by carefully defending those control plots, prevented them from being burned, and thus we could see a kind of a comparison with time, following initially and then following the burn with time after, as the ecosystem corrects itself. Within the plots, then, to assess intensity, we laid out thermocouples as well as color changing paint pyrometers, and good reasonable agreement between those, so it was good to have both techniques. And we monitored both combination of surface fire temperature, aerial temperature at above the soil, and then the soil temperature approximately 1 centimeter into the soil. So these soils are extremely shallow. In the case of the restored sites, we're talking 3 to 5 centimeters. So not a whole lot of soil in general in these areas, as well as we wanted to test one of the factors of a fire being how intense is it on these soils in these types of fires. Not any kind of ponderosa pine sort of system here. We harvested biomass to get ideas of just how much a nutrient budget there was before and after the fire. Lots of labor-intensive things there, as well as you can see the weed whacker back there in the back that is isolating our control plot, giving us a fire break there. The fire occurred in May, and conditions were appropriate, good, I guess. I can tell you that I'm not exactly a fire expert, but mostly it was intended that this would be a head fire, and we wanted temperatures to try to get as hot as they could. Obviously, in a grassland type system, very short duration fires. We'll see that in a second. But in some cases, woody vegetation still standing. In other cases, complete removal of all vegetation, and the landscape looks completely different following that fire. All the equipment, the thermocouples and the pyrometers did their job, so we were very pleased with that. And then with time, monitoring both the site conditions, vegetation composition, but also then the nutrient dynamics and the microbial and biogeochemical processes that are going on in the soils at these sites to sort of give us an indication. What is the immediate response? What is the more short term? And then maybe not truthfully a long term, but longer term up to a year after it. And you can see that the sites, they rebound rather quickly, and they certainly green up rather quickly. And then the vegetation after a year, in some cases, it was very, very difficult to see the difference. You could see the difference in terms of maybe removal of woody vegetation, but in the reference, I think what we clearly could, the only discernible feature was the lack of above ground standing dead material. It was about equal biomass, but just not as much standing dead and surface litter. Okay. So to characterize intensities of the fires, this is the thermocouple data. These are averages of 3 thermocouples, and the very short duration fires, and on the order of 5 minutes. In general, based on not exactly a direct linkage with biomass, but certainly biomass type and density. The more herbaceous, but lots of standing dead material contained in the reference, that is the low phosphorus but reference material or reference areas, an abundance of Muhlenbergia, clump-forming grasses, sawgrass, cladium, and those fires were in general hotter than their restored counterparts. So high elevation was definitely a hotter fire in general than the low elevation fires. And the reference areas had in generally hotter temperatures than the restored fires, and that owing again to the fact that there was a little bit more shrubby material, probably a little bit more green shrubby material, so it less burning, and also a lot more sparsely vegetated restored areas than the reference areas. So the reference areas are a good thick grassland kind of distribution, and they burn very well. In terms of soil temperatures, one of our initial questions was just how much would this affect the soil temperature? Would it sterilize the soil? Would we get lots of different types of biogeochemical or biochemical reactions that took place with organic matter and some of the things in the soil? Our soil temperatures only achieved maybe about 10 degrees C of a bump in their temperature, and in some cases approached 50 degrees, maybe 55 degrees Celsius. But 70 degrees Celsius is generally what is assumed to be the most detrimental type of temperature. So according to that, then we did not really achieve any kind of soil sterilization temperatures, or not necessarily surprising, but good to definitely know that these are typical kinds of grassland fires where the temperature is not transmitted into the soil very, very far. There are some interesting cases of surface litter materials when they burn. The effect it has on the biotic community of the periphyte and the superficial algal crust that is on these sites. In the dry season, when these things are burned, some of that actually will combust the periphyte as well. But superficially, soil temperature is not that affected as much. The other, I guess, main rule of thumb that people have, or dogma that's out there, is that the effect of the fire is going to be most seen clearly in terms of loss or volatilization of carbon and nitrogen. But then also the other major factor is going to be the deposition of ash. And in this system, that's one of our key parameters that we are very interested in, is just how much ash is being converted from the above ground pool and then deposited into the below ground pool. And in this case, we attempted, in one case it was very successful, in the other one I'm not so sure, but we attempted to capture, quantify, and come up with a nutrient budget for just how much of that biomass was being converted and deposited. And so in the reference area, you can see that even though it's a dense amount of above ground vegetation, and it burns very well, even though you have a low phosphorus content in that vegetation, in that tissue, and so as it's combusted, the ash that is deposited, or the deposition of residues that is deposited, only accounts or amounts for about 20 milligrams of phosphorus per meter squared. Small, but in the Everglades, this is highly significant. This is years of phosphorus load to these systems. So in a natural case, we're talking about 1 to 2, maybe even 3 years of phosphorus deposition equivalent in a burning event. So obviously that is going to be, and all at once, that's going to be a pulse of phosphorus to the system. There is one aspect of this which is clearly that much of the deposition of that phosphorus is accounted for in the deposition or accumulation on the periphyton. That periphyton, again, is that surface algal community, which in the Everglades is characteristic. It's very thick, on the order of centimeters thick, and is one of your higher productivity components in the system. So especially in the reference area, the periphyton is largely unaffected by the fire, but it does serve as the direct beneficiary of the deposition of that ash. You see that in the increase of that. In the restored areas, not quite so much success, and for various reasons. The restored areas, the vegetation is much more complex and much more diffuse and sparse, and so some of that could have been sampling error, where we were only able to account for about a little bit more than 50% of our expected phosphorus. But clearly, based on the changes in the above ground live biomass and the dead biomass, you can see that the amount of phosphorus contained in that system is, based on the concentration of phosphorus in the system, much more deposition or much more potential for returning, about double the amount in the reference area, from the vegetation, combustion, and deposition of ash back into that system. Periphyton, again, in that system intercepts much of that. The question of where the other goes could be up to some speculation, could be wind transported, not exactly sure, but my feeling on this is that it was a sampling combination of sparse vegetation and sampling that led to us not being able to recover all of it. But clearly, based on concentrations and the amount present initially and then after, we can clearly see that there's a much higher amount of phosphorus in the restored area that comes down as deposition on the surface. The long-term effect of that was one thing that was really interesting to us, and one of the main things that we focused on. Because that deposition of phosphorus in the sense that we are looking at a phosphorus limited system and a condition where we're trying to achieve a phosphorus limited system, the deposition of phosphorus would obviously affect that. So in monitoring the vegetation after the fact, you can see that the effect that the deposition had on the regrowth of the vegetation after the fire, And based on the nitrogen to phosphorus ratios, which is a strong indicator of nutrient limitation, ideally these systems would are typically the boundary between nitrogen limitation and phosphorus limitation by the total nitrogen to total phosphorus ratio is about 30 in these systems. And so below that line, you are considered more nitrogen limited or clearly nitrogen limited. And then above that line, you are generally speaking more phosphorus limited. So if you look at the net effect of the deposition of the phosphorus and the conversion of phosphorus and the loss of nitrogen and carbon, if you will, from the system, but the vegetation as it regrows clearly has a different amount of available nutrient. And in my experience in these sites, it would be that the phosphorus is the one driving this relationship. And so in the restored sites, the blue lines here, the restored sites had very little direct effect of the deposition of the phosphorus, but that throughout the entire year following that, a more steady decline and a return, where in many cases the sites were, at least one of the sites was above nitrogen, more phosphorus limited. It had a higher T into TP ratio. After the burn, you see a gradual decline with the regrowth. So the vegetation 1 year later in the restored plots was more nitrogen limited than it had begun, than it had started. And we'll talk about that later, the implications of that. The reference area, different response to that because the amount of phosphorus contained in that above vegetation, the reference site is clearly very phosphorus limited. So the deposition of that, even the small amount of deposition in that residual ash, shifted and was very useful, if you could say, to the regrowth of the vegetation in that system. And for a time being, that phosphorus became available. The vegetation that regrew had a lower nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, so it means less phosphorus limited. And then with time, though, we're starting to see an increase. And it'd be interesting to go back to these sites and monitor it again. But now you are, again, 1 year after the fire, the reference area is now responded back, and it has resulted in regaining its more phosphorus limited status. But the pulse of that phosphorus, I think, is visible here after the short term after 1 month of the fire. So two different responses. The reference area seems to be more short-term duration in terms of that pulse of phosphorus, while the reference area, even another interesting fact is that it's a slow decline continuously with time, and it appears to not even be correcting itself 1 year after the burn. It appears to, in other words, it's going to take a little bit longer, and some of that could have something to do with the intensity of the burn combined with the type of residues that are produced in that burn. And so here, just a little lab experiment that we did, and you can clearly see the difference between very completely combusted ash, the white material, as well as the char material that forms in there, the incompletely combusted charcoal remains that are left from the plants. We did an experiment to see, and this has been done before, but we did it with the species in this case just to see how the nutrients are affected and available depending on what residues you form or the completeness of combustion. And the one preliminary thing that we were interested in this is that the restored sites, high phosphorus, more woody vegetation with lower intensity of burns would be somewhere down in the lower temperature range in combustion and thus produce more chars. And that was observed, but it's difficult to quantify, so this is just speculation. But in our laboratory experiment, generating this sequence of combustion residues, we could clearly see that at moderate combustion temperatures, where you're forming kind of a somewhat mixture of ash and char, typical of your fires, you get the maximum amount of extractable phosphorus. Whereas if you can completely combust and achieve more ash formation, you start to see that your extractable, available, and inorganic phosphorus, which is the quote available kind of phosphorus coming from that ash material, it starts to decline above that temperature as you progressively form more ash. And this residual material, this unextractable, not available form of phosphorus, increases with high temperature. And so high temperatures form this ash, and the ash is actually not so straightforward that it's just a highly available leachable phosphorus. There's actually a component of it that is increasing in its resistance to extraction. And so that's an important finding. We followed that up with a determination of what kind of mechanism is going on with that. And analyzing the ash from some of these sites, you see that the ash is dominated by calcium carbonate, which is the residual of calcium oxide formed in the fire through combustion, which combines with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, forms calcium carbonate, calcite, quartz left over from the plant cell walls. And we also notice, though, that there is a presence of, in terms of phosphorus, that inorganic phosphorus component, the mineral of apatite, calcium phosphate, which is very stable, a very stable mineral. It is, in terms of wetlands, like the Everglades, it's considered the lockbox of phosphorus, so it's not readily soluble. It is more a long-term, very recalcitrant mineral that forms. Ideal if you could form this in a system where you're trying to achieve phosphorus limitation. To be able to convert that phosphorus into apatite is crucial. So in the fire, then, our kind of hypothetical model is what happens. High temperatures form the calcium, magnesium, the aluminum oxides. Those oxides are highly reactive, and if present at high temperature with the phosphorus liberated in the ash, you can achieve, the documentation here is that you can achieve the formation of the stable phosphorus mineral. So the fact that when you combust this material, you're left with 50% that's approximately available and extractable, but the 50% that's unavailable, some of it could be in the form of this apatite. And that's an important finding for these ecosystems and just the effect of fire. And we'll come back to that a little bit later too. So the nutrients, especially phosphorus, were definitely highly interested in it, but also tied to phosphorus, particularly in the southern Everglades, nitrogen is an important element as well. Obviously, in a system that is not limited by phosphorus, nitrogen availability is an important thing related to productivity. The southern Everglades and some of these wetlands, nitrogen is the pollutant that gets to marine systems and the coastal systems, and that is where it becomes a eutrophication driver. So what does a fire do to these southern marshes in the Everglades, which are hydrologically connected to other systems? That's an important question to ask as well. And it also, in the restoration process, high phosphorus in the restored sites places an importance on nitrogen cycling to determine that system's progressing toward phosphorus limitation. So we wanted to investigate some of that. Ash deposition, obviously, from a case of manipulating pH, but also as a phosphorus source, is going to have a role to play in nitrogen cycling. In particular, we would anticipate, and we thought we would see phosphorus being deposited, phosphorus leading to more nitrogen limitation, so more nitrogen fixation by especially those algal communities that are receiving that big pulse of phosphorus. As well as, though, the difference between ash materials and char materials. Some of the char materials in our own work, we've seen that there's residual nitrogen in there, and many studies document that after a fire you see an increase in nitrate or in some forms of nitrogen. So the incomplete combustion of biomass can lead to an increase in nitrogen availability. We observe that in our fires for both sites. Increased, and these are extractable levels of nitrate on the top and extractable ammonium on the bottom for both the restored sites on the left and the reference sites on the right. And these graphs are going to be something that for the next several we're going to use. You obviously have the bars to represent the colored bar representing the burn plot, and then the white bar representing the control, and that is all represented by the left axis. But the right axis, on the right axis, we have this ratio of the burn plot to the control plot, just to show a relative comparison of what is happening with time. And in some cases this is informative, some cases it's not so informative, but that would mean that a burn to control ratio of 1 means very little change between the two, very little difference between the two. Whereas if you're very positive, the burn side is elevated in that parameter, and if you're below 1, the control side is elevated relative to the burn side. So in the case of nitrogen, extractable levels of nitrate and ammonium in almost all sites, immediately after the fire, we definitely see higher levels of ammonium, higher levels of nitrate. And in the restored areas, or in the reference areas, this is somewhat persistent for especially nitrate. Ammonium quickly diminishes, and for factors that that relate to the cycling of nitrogen and the input of phosphorus, generation of nitrogen from mineralization is what is likely causing that. But in the restored areas, you see that you get elevated nitrogen, but that the effect diminishes, and that even with time, especially for ammonium, you can actually get the reverse. The ratio lowers below 1 after even a month, and then upwards of a year. There is less available nitrogen in the burn plots of the restored area, and that likely is a combination of the high phosphorus levels in those sites. The regrowth of vegetation places a higher demand for nitrogen, and so the plants, when they regrow, are just taking up that available nitrogen more so than, remember, the reference site achieves and goes back to a phosphorus limited state more quickly, and so there's not so much demand for nitrogen in those plots. But the finding that we did see elevated nitrogen in these plots could be a factor of two things. One is the phosphorus stimulating microbial decomposition, or just the ability of the residues to leach available forms of nitrogen, which we have also observed in both cases. The added amount, or the added importance of the available nitrate, the increase in available nitrate, led to a short-term, transient, if you will, stimulation of denitrification, so the conversion of nitrate into atmospheric nitrogen gas. And denitrification is limited by carbon, but also by nitrogen. And in this case, the addition of available nitrate in that system highly correlated with the denitrifying potential that we observed in these systems. And so that pulse of nitrate that increased, whether it's by increasing nitrification, producing the nitrate, or the nitrate came from the materials themselves, resulted in higher losses of nitrogen from this just biogeochemical microbial process. The one curious aspect of this, we expected to, in fact, since I've done a lot of work on nitrogen fixation by the periphyton in this system, I highly expected it to be sensitive to the deposition of phosphorus, especially in the reference area. And we did not find a strong amount of nitrogen fixation. The closest we could come was in the restored areas, where we do see the means are elevated in the burn plots in the long term. Now remember, the above ground vegetation long term is also showing that the system is getting lower and lower and lower in its available nitrogen, so more nitrogen limited with time. So maybe this is an indication that this system is more nitrogen limited than when it started. But the reference should have shown some kind of stimulation by that material. And so it's very puzzling why, when you deposit that much phosphorus on this system, that you would not see so much nitrogen fixation by that algal community. And one reason for that could be that there is an increase in nitrate. There is an increase in available ammonium from the residues or from the system, and so that results in a bit of inhibition. Available nitrogen will suppress nitrogen fixation. So with time, we did not see that in the reference as much as we should. We are currently investigating this, though, in laboratory experiments to see if it is a question of inhibition by, say, nitrogen coming from the char material, and if it is a stimulation that could be possible given the deposition of just ash or something like that. So we're still looking at this, but not as great a result as we thought we would see. two soil enzymes, and I'll just briefly talk about this. Two soil enzymes, L-aminopeptidase and N-acetylglucosaminidase. This represents more of a bacterial decomposition and nitrogen mineralization decomposition, and this represents, NAG represents more of a fungal related parameter. The long and the short of this is that in the reference area in particular, the LAP, the bacterial to fungal, the LAP to NAG, bacterial to fungal ratios of these two enzymes shift dramatically, favoring bacterial dominance after the fire. And so we definitely, through these enzymes, we did not see that effect so strongly in the restored plots, but in the reference plots, we clearly can see that there's a stimulation of the enzymes after the fire in certain cases, but then mostly there is a shift in species composition of that community. That's, again, reflective of either the input of phosphorus or the potential input of the non-combusted residues, etc., coming from that. And so that's another interesting finding that we are only beginning to think about. Related, and what some people would find more exciting, would be the carbon cycling. And in this regard, we looked at decomposition in the system, and decomposition of these residues, like the results I'm going to show you for respiration and methanogenesis, not as clear a picture as we had hoped. In some cases, we clearly see stimulation of these, and we've done these experiments in other parts of the Everglades that are phosphorus limited. When you add phosphorus to them, you see the stimulation of microbial activity in the form of enzyme expression and then respiration and methanogenesis. And in this case, we did not see a very clear, not as clear as we would like to see, response by these communities. Could be a variety of field sampling and ecological sorts of experimental design questions. So to follow this up, and I'll show you the results of the respiration. In some cases, we clearly see an inhibition of respiration, anaerobic, aerobic, and methanogenesis by certain aspects of the fire. And then in other cases, we see a long-term stimulation. So again, short-term or long-term stimulation. So there's some mixed effects of what's going on with the microbial communities and their response to the burn residues being deposited. We do not think, again, going back to temperature, we do not think that there's an elevated sterilization process going on in these. The temperatures just did not get that high. Possibly on an isolated case, but not wholesale. And so we followed this up and compared this with a laboratory amendment study where we took materials that were purified ash and purified char, if there ever was such a term, but hand-picked char from some combustion experiments and then added ash separately from the char and then in combination. But the results shown here, I'm going to show you for the results for methanogenesis, but the same was also true for carbon dioxide respiration production in these systems. And so all that's doing is telling us a relative activity of the microorganisms. When we added ash by itself to, and so let's take the low phosphorus reference case first. That's kind of easiest. But both ash and char, when added singly and in combination, resulted in stimulated respiration and stimulated methanogenesis. And this would agree with what we thought we would suspect. What we had suspected and hypothesized was that the addition of phosphorus to these systems was going to result in stimulation of microbial activity, and the low phosphorus system would be more susceptible to that. In the high phosphorus case, we didn't really know if it was going to amount to anything, but we saw stimulation by the char, but not by the ash. And in fact, the ash showed us a decline, like an inhibition, very similar to what we had seen in the field. So we pondered and wondered, and we compared these results with another experiment, which was just a direct nutrient experiment, wondering what could be resulting in the ash and the char. And the long and the short of it is that the ash likely represents, as we would have thought, more of a phosphorus. And so what I have, what I have is the results from the residue addition experiment on the top. the results from a pure nutrient addition experiment on the bottom, where we added phosphorus or we added carbon as glucose. And so when we add, and so comparing them together, you can see the relative change and also just the specific compound response. And so ash, very appropriately in the reference area, the low P reference area, very adequately represents, ash represents what? Phosphorus, and we expect that. The available form of phosphorus in ash, whatever small or amount there is, that available phosphorus stimulates just like adding phosphorus directly to the soil. What we noticed also is that char acts like both a phosphorus and a carbon amendment, and so we get, if you add carbon by itself, you get a stimulation. If you add char, you kind of get an additive of some phosphorus with some carbon, so it's a combination effect there. In the restored site, this explained some of what we are seeing, is that we have seen when you add phosphorus to those soils, you get only minimal, if any, kind of effect. But if you add carbon to these sites, then you get the big response. And the reason you get the big response is because they are not phosphorus limited. They are high phosphorus sites. They are carbon limited in these carbon respiration kinds of processes. So adding carbon duplicates what we see in adding char. And so we think it is the carbon aspect of char that is being available in these cases. And that, it agrees with some research studies out there, or it disagrees with some of these studies saying that this biochar or black carbon, is not so available. But in this case, it looks like that biochar or char material is stimulating respiration in these areas as a carbon source. The one thing that we still wonder about is the effect of adding ash, which actually decreases respiration. And we think that may have something to do with possibly even reacting with phosphorus and limiting it, or affecting pH locally and disturbing the microbial communities. So again, not exactly clear on what's going on with that. So just to summarize all these things and hopefully give a little bit better picture in our mind of what phosphorus and what a fire does to the nutrient cycles in these wetlands. Combustion obviously results in a direct large loss of carbon and nitrogen, complete combustion more or less, drastically altering the plant communities, etc. Depositing these materials, both ash and char materials, affects nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon cycles. They in turn interact with microbial biomass and or the periphyton communities in these systems, and then the regrowth happens. And I apologize, the arrows have certainly not been fixed by PowerPoint. But the cycling of nitrogen as a result of this can be stimulated both by a direct deposition of nitrogen, just an increase in the amount of nitrogen, and so we see that, but also an indirect stimulation of phosphorus, which increases nitrogen, which can then fuel back into plant regrowth, but also increase the loss mechanism from the system. As it regrows, that can be incorporated in. Nitrogen fixation, again, still out there. We did not see the response that we thought we would see, but again, we hold out hope for that in future experiments. Two mechanisms for phosphorus and carbon, in that carbon can be sequestered as black carbon. Phosphorus could be sequestered as apatite, as long as we prove that under field conditions. And that would have huge implications then for a fire in one of these systems, a sequestration mechanism. But both carbon and phosphorus, in the form of the ash and the char materials, carbon in the char materials, stimulates microbial biomass and can also result in added respiration, microbial activity, and the production of the two greenhouse gases, methane and CO2. So again, long-term or short-term pulses and stimulating of the microbial biogeochemical processes. In terms of restoration, what does this mean? And in this may directly only apply, I would say, to this South Florida calcareous phosphorus limited system. But in our situation, the system undergoes, the process of restoration is a conversion of these highly available phosphorus forms, the inorganic forms, in the residual soil material that wasn't scraped, or in the crushed material when they scrape it. But the rock, as it dissolves, becomes that inorganic. As the ecosystem develops and soil depth increases and the plants, successive cycles, they gradually convert that inorganic into organic forms. And the organic is much less available. It requires enzymatic hydrolysis before it can be returned back to the plant. So it is much less available than a direct, almost fertilizer available phosphorus source. So what we see in years after the clearing is, as the system develops, in the early part it is clearly high phosphorus availability and the system is nitrogen limited. In the older systems, and that means it's drawn here that we can start to see the evidence of phosphorus limitation even as early as, say, 16 to 20 years, but it takes hundreds of years before we will get the true phosphorus limited system that we're desiring. And so the amount of time that some of these older 20-year-old, 50-year-old, etc. systems spend in this period where they are limited by both nitrogen and phosphorus, before they get to this purely phosphorus limited state, that is the true definition of restoration. And so a system in this case would be more nitrogen limited, and thus adding phosphorus to it would have a different response than one of these systems where phosphorus was beginning to be limited, and it would do damage. So what does a fire do to this? A fire removes nitrogen. We know that. It increases the nitrogen loss mechanisms, both from volatilization but also from denitrification after the fire. But it also adds a pulse of phosphorus to the system, and therefore it would shift it almost back, reset it back in time to be closer to when it was cleared. So it would shift it back to a more nitrogen-limited state. That is our worry, I guess you could say, in terms of restoration. And I don't want to sound too alarmist about that. We'll talk about that. But just to summarize what we've covered here, clearly fire affects all the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus cycles that we were measuring. Undoubtedly has an effect on every biogeochemical cycle. In the case of phosphorus, just a direct conversion of that stored up organic phosphorus converts it right back into a potentially available form of phosphorus. So major implications for phosphorus limited systems. Nitrogen cycle, shift in the availability of the nitrogen, increase of the loss processes through denitrification, and maybe nitrogen fixation will respond in some way. We did not have good evidence of that, but we still suspect that it should be there. The carbon cycle obviously can be the char material as a carbon source, but then the phosphorus that comes with the char and the ash, in this case, directly stimulates or can stimulate the soil microorganisms. Clearly, or maybe not clearly, but important factor in fire intensity as how much of the nutrient transformation occurs, what types of residues are formed, and how many of those residues are returned to the system. Very important. Factors such as how much woody versus herbaceous, very important in this thing, as we have done in some of our lab burns. The importance of woody vegetation is to sway that to definitely form more char materials. Elevation and moisture conditions during the burn haven't been explored yet in our studies, but wouldn't surprise me if they had a big deal to play with how much combustion completeness there is and how much char material you form. The formation of that ash versus char has big implications from our studies in terms of how much is available in phosphorus and not. Surprising to us was that you can actually discourage phosphorus availability, get lower phosphorus availability with increasing temperatures and more completeness of burn, and the potential for the formation of apatite, which is that resistant phosphorus mineral at high temperature. That would be maybe what you're shooting for. And so combine those two with the type of system you have. In our case, we're on a gradient from nitrogen limited systems all the way to phosphorus limited systems. The effect of that burn, the characteristics of that burn, and the type of residues that you form is going to determine whether that is a good thing or a bad thing for a particular system. Obviously, people are interested in the vegetation aspects of it, but the higher phosphorus systems have different vegetation already. They have different productivity rates. Those things need to be taken into factor or into account when you're planning a burn, and you want to be concerned with these nutrient issues. And I would say yes, we should be concerned with these. In our case, we say, or we think, that certain types of fires, especially in the restored cases, in the native areas, the fire tends to be something that is more required. We definitely see the importance of that, because the pulse of phosphorus is lower, and the pulse of phosphorus is dealt with, it seems to be, more quickly than in the restored areas where you have high phosphorus. Lower intensity fires, probably more char material forming, and then that char material slowly releasing that phosphorus more long term. So the effect of a fire may be more longer lasting in the restored areas. So the restored systems can be set back by a fire. So particular effort needs to be focused on the frequency of this to both manage vegetation, which is an important characteristic of why we burn, but also to minimize that potential for phosphorus being leached back into the system, made more available in the system that we're trying to tie that phosphorus up. And my recommendation is certainly that we need to try to promote, in those cases, hotter fires. If appetite can be formed, then there's a potential that a hotter fire can produce more appetite, and that may in long term be a very, very good thing. So balancing this with vegetation management to accumulate types of fuel and etc., to try to get those as hot as we can, and manage that better manage, I would say. But all of this, again, requires much more, I think, study on that. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions that you have. I think I ran a little bit long, so I apologize, David, for that. Any questions that you may have, and thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Patrick Inglett, University of Florida. Once again, if you just joined us during the presentation, my name is David Godwin. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for the Southern Fire Exchange, and we just had a really great and comprehensive presentation from Dr. Patrick Inglett from the Soil and Water Science Department, University of Florida. So as we mentioned earlier, if you have questions for Dr. Inglett, please go ahead and type them in the chat pod on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will see if he's go ahead and answer those questions. And as folks go ahead and start typing those in, I had a couple of questions myself. I'll go ahead and take the opportunity. So it sounds like those, Dr. Inglett, the higher temperatures there may be the key in terms of promoting a recalcitrant state of phosphorus in these systems. Have you had the opportunity, or do you know of folks who are looking into similar questions in areas that have been burned with wildfires as opposed to prescribed fires?
I do not know of anybody who is looking into this. In fact, we're trying to confirm in a better way the observation that we had. We've had it in a couple of cases where we did measure appetite. So we're trying to confirm that first and get that out. Now, I would assume that people would then be more interested in that result. So let's hold off on that one, I guess.
Right.
But yeah, good question.
And okay, I'll see if anybody else has a question put in here. I had one other question for you, I suppose. So this longer-term goal of these sites, as you say, has become a P-limited system. And in some cases, it looks like the prescribed fire is not necessarily moving towards that goal, at least in the immediate term, is my understanding. Do you think that there's a role for mechanical treatments that might lead to the regular removal of some of that biomass accumulated phosphorus?
Are you saying things like mowing and those kinds of issues?
Mm-hmm. Mowing or other kind of mechanical treatments where the material, instead of leaving it on site to then recycle, is actually removed, kind of like what initially occurred with the soils, but a regular mechanical removal of the vegetation.
Right. We have posed that question to them. We've even investigated some, say, localized types of amendments to speed up the process, maybe some like chemical amendments, etc. And I wouldn't say that that's going to catch on very well. I'm not sure that there's a great amendment, first of all, to speed up ecology, because that process of accumulating the organic phosphorus is slow, just to put it that way. And we don't really want to go out there with trying to speed up the ecosystem with fertilizing and those kinds of issues. Chemical amendments, some of them show promise, but not great promise. And so to do it wholesale on those large areas is the question. That's the key. And they haven't invested in any of that kind of thing. And they considered the some European sites to in the same kind of situation to try to remediate and restore ag systems that have a lot of soil accumulated nutrients. They do that. They mow and they take all the clippings and biomass and remove it. That again takes a long time, and the hole in the donut people haven't explored that just for the logistical cost, I guess.
Much larger area.
Yeah, much larger area, and they're also. I mean, I got to give them credit that in terms of the comparison between what the shyness was and what this system is, you're 90% functional, there. So as far as their credits of mitigation banking, etc., it's successful. So I think we're talking about fine tuning and tweaking. And
Okay, thank you. It looks like we have a question here from Paula Benshoff, and she says, with the move to limit burns and drought conditions, what do you see the effect of burning only in times when wetlands hold water, as compared to when KBDI levels are higher?
I think that is a system-specific answer. Depends on, again, my feeling is that you need to be as complete in your burn as possible. And I would assume, and this is just me, I'm assuming, I know some people, Dr. Osborne, for example, who has worked with those cases where the system is flooded and you just top off the vegetation, you just burn down to the water. And in those cases, they do record the increase in nutrient in the water column, and it's a short pulse event. But in terms of and it may have a different management implication for those systems, because I think those are usually more nutrient accumulating. They want it to be flooded to accumulate the nutrients. It may or may not be detrimental in that case. In this case, those nutrients in the vegetation are directly returned to the soil. And every bit of, I guess, what is combusted winds up being back in that system. There is no moving it away, etc. And these are, I would compare them to low intensity. Some of those Phragmites type burns that they have in deeper water areas, those things are really intense. And I honestly, I don't know how much char versus ash and those kinds of questions are going on in there. But certainly in our case, we don't get that nearly that kind of flame length and those kind of temperatures. So I hope that answers your question. Honestly, I don't know if there is a great question for that, but I wouldn't be, in this case, I would definitely tell the managers, don't let it get moist. In many cases, they are limited in their fire season by the reemergence of those rains, which increase the fuel moisture, and then they can't burn. So we don't have that problem in the south of Florida, but some of those other wetlands, it's okay. You get plenty of dry fuel above the water level, and you can go through and roast it. So, don't know.
We have a question from Joe Royce, and he says, can we infer any of these results to wetlands with organic soils, or are these systems just too different?
I think that they would be, in certain aspects, they would be directly applicable to some of our more peat-based systems. Same kind of mechanisms for calcium and reactions with phosphorus, stabilizing them, especially in South Florida systems. Same kind of mechanism to stabilize phosphorus. You want to accumulate organic matter, and and calcium also reacts with it. So as long as, I'm not going to go saying that we should burn the peat, but if there is the case where you can get a hot burn and you can form apatite, that apatite would be stable in those in the peat soils as well. As far as it being a nutrient pulse, they would be, I would say, much more susceptible to if they were the phosphorus limited kind of peats in the Everglades, a pulse of phosphorus to those soils, you would see a big response of, I'm thinking, a big response of the periphyton community, which is has a high uptake potential for phosphorus, and you would also see greater stimulation by those soil microorganisms, particularly those involved with methanogenesis, which we've seen as well. I think a lot of this does. Again, my last caveat with the system kind of thing is it is specific to different systems. If you're in a system where you have nitrogen limited peats, I'm not sure that the same kinds of rules are going to apply. Fire would have a different role, probably more from the nitrogen availability side. But in our cases where it's all phosphorus limited peats and marls, I think they do have the same kinds of processes.
Okay. Well, does anyone else have any questions? I know we're kind of running towards the end of our time allotment here. Just a minute. See if anyone types in there. Okay. Well, thanks again, Dr. Patrick Inglett, for joining us today. We really appreciate your presentation. And we'd also like to thank everyone who joined us in our audience, and we hope that this webinar will be useful in your fire management and fire research programs. We do ask that you take just a couple of minutes to click on the questionnaire link in the middle of the slide screen there today, and let us know how we could tailor our future webinars to better suit your fire science need. Today's webinar was recorded, as we mentioned earlier, and will be archived for later viewing on the Southern Fire Exchange YouTube page. And so check on our website at southernfireexchange.org, and we'll have a link to that in about a week. So once again, thanks again, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Inglett, for joining us. Everybody, have a great afternoon.
Thank you, David. I had a blast.